Welcome, everyone. My name is Alan Brislowski. I am a senior project manager at the Partnership for LA Schools, and I'll be introducing the series today. Our successful California Instructional Materials Adoption webinar series is a part of a coalition of the organizations that you see on this slide. Next slide. This session today is brought to you by two of the organizations in our coalition, Unbound Ed and the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. You can read a little more about the work we do on this slide, and the links to our organization's websites are going to be added to the chat if you'd like to learn more. On the next slide, I'll introduce the folks who made this session possible. Thanks, Maria, for adding those links to the chat. This is the team that brought this session to life today. You're currently hearing from me, Alan, and you'll soon hear from Cara Nofre from the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, who's moderating our panel discussion today soon. You'll also see our other colleagues, Maria, Diana, and Johanna, in the chat behind the scenes of this session. Next slide, thank you. We're here today on November 28th, highlighting best practices in supporting teachers in the adoption process. We're joined by our special guests from Aspire Public Schools LA and Capistrano Unified School District. You'll see links in the chat in a second to register for our last upcoming session, focusing on selection and implementation highlights from LAUSD and us, the Partnership for LA Schools, on December 12th. Please register and share with your colleagues. This session and our previous, focusing on the crucial first steps of the adoption process with Santa Maria Bonita School District and Granada Hills Charter, is also available for you to watch and will be shared by email. Next slide, please. Here's today's agenda. We are close to wrapping up the first portion, or the welcome section of our agenda, and getting to the most exciting part of the session, our district stories. Our special guests will introduce themselves, and we will kick off our panel discussion featuring questions some of you have pre-submitted when you registered. We'll then have a few minutes for Q&A, so please continue to add your questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then lastly, we will close out and wrap up. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our objectives today are twofold. First is to highlight successful math instructional material adoption stories of California local education agencies of different sizes and contexts. And secondly, to share guidance and resources for other California LEAs who are planning to adopt math instructional materials in the near future, given the recent adoption of the 2023 California Math Framework. It's important to note that you'll hear LEA stories about their adoption and which materials they selected. Our organization and this series are curriculum agnostic, which means that we are not endorsing nor encouraging the adoption of any particular set of materials, but rather focusing on sharing stories of success from around the state. Next slide, please. There is spectacular work on instructional materials being done across the state, and we're excited to spotlight two LEAs today who we know from previous work together. Both of the LEAs you'll hear from this session have participated in workshops from the California Curriculum Collaborative, or Cal Curriculum. And I wanted to quickly introduce Cal Curriculum, as it may come up in some of the answers shared. Cal Curriculum is a partnership between EdReports and Unbound Ed, which is hosting this session alongside us, the Partnership for LA Schools, with the goal of supporting California educators in the adoption of high-quality instructional materials through independent reviews, actionable resources, all tailored to the California context. Cal Curriculum is also curriculum agnostic, and you can learn more about it in the link in the chat. You'll hear from Partnership for LA Schools and LAUSD Schools in our third session. Next slide, please. It's my pleasure to introduce our special guests for today from Aspire Public Schools and Capistrano Unified School District. You'll hear from Leilani, Superintendent of Equitable Instruction, and Ronnie, Mathematics Academic Program Manager from Aspire Public Schools, and Karen from Capistrano Unified School District. With that, I'll hand this off to Leilani and Ronnie to share more about Aspire Public Schools.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. My name is Leilani Lafari. I am the Superintendent of Equitable Instruction at Aspire Public Schools. And some quick facts about us. We are a CMO in Los Angeles, Southeast Los Angeles, and South Los Angeles. We have about over 4,000 students that we serve. Our demographics are we have 96.82% unduplicated pupils, and we serve about 30% of students who are English language learners. I'll pass the rest to Ronnie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ronnie Hernandez. I am the Math Academic Program Manager for Aspire Public Schools. Been a former math teacher, coach, director, content specialist, all math-related roles. Let me tell you a little bit more about our organization. For the curriculum adoption process, I was a project lead. So I was tasked with designing the curriculum adoption process and leading us through our curriculum adoption. Leilani, as a SUP of Equitable Instruction, acted as a supervisor and overseeing our curriculum and content across all grade levels and all content areas, and act as a thought partnership in order to improve and enhance the process throughout. Our adoption process was a little over a year. We started in May of 2022 and went all the way through July of 2023. So we're now in an implementation year. We ended up going with iReady Classroom Mathematics 2024. So that's what we are currently using in our classrooms. We were intentional about adopting a curriculum off cycle, and you can see a couple reasons why there. The first and the primary reason was our data was telling us that we needed to do something different for our students. We weren't meeting the needs, and we needed something a little more robust and providing more resources to meet the needs of all learners. And the other major reason was the curriculum we were using was heavy on direct instruction. So a lot of teacher talking, a lot of teacher doing, and that wasn't aligned with our instructional vision and our pedagogical approach that we wanted to take in mathematics. And so with that, we decided to move forward with the early adoption process and are now fully into our curriculum. I will now pass it over to Erin.
It would be good if you unmute, right? There we go. There's a rookie move there. Sorry about that. My name is Karen Gauthier. I am the STEM coordinator administrator, K-12 in Capistrano Unified School District, which is in Southern California. And my district serves close to 43,000 students. What we'll be talking about here today was a math pilot that is still ongoing right now, serving close to 18,000 elementary students across 35 elementary school sites. So my role in the adoption and the pilot was as an administrator and coordinator, facilitator, but really supporting our educational partners. So really looking at how we can make sure that this pilot process included all of those educational partners, parents, students, teachers, administrators. Our adoption timeline started last January, and as you can see, our adoption milestone is we're currently piloting Curriculum Associates iReady 2024 and Imagine Learning's version of illustrative math. Our primary motivator kind of echoes what Ronnie said, is that our data was telling us we weren't meeting the needs of all of our students. And it is a goal and a direction for all educational partners to think of the needs of all students. So when we saw that our materials weren't aligned and it was a lot of direct instruction, we started the process of thinking through this 7 years ago. So we also have a very heavy focus on multi-tiered systems of support and how are we reaching our students both for intervention as well as extension. And as we looked at our data, we realized that, like I alluded to before, that we weren't meeting the needs of our multilingual learners. We do have close to 10%, a little over 10% of multilingual learners in Capistrano Unified. We also wanted to make sure that we could support our students at varying language proficiency levels. We have a lot of students that are coming in as newcomers more heavily in the last couple of years than we have had in the past, and so the need is great.
Thank you so much for introducing your districts. I'm now going to turn it over to Cara Nofre from the Partnership for LA Schools. to facilitate our panel discussion. Cara, take it away.
Thanks so much, Alan. My name is Cara Onofre, and I am so privileged to be able to join both Capistrano and Aspire today to talk about their adoption process and to learn more about everything that they've learned as they've engaged and embarked on this journey. So, as you know, buy-in and mindset are really essential pieces of a successful adoption. And I'd love to know what your district or your CMO's mindset is when it comes to teacher needs as they're seen in instructional materials. How did you build on that mindset? And how did you help find consensus? Ronnie and Leilani, would you like to start?
Sure, I can start. And so I would say the mindset really for Aspire was that we were going to ask the people who were going to be most affected by this decision, and those were the teachers. And so we had a process that was really led by teacher input, and that was our mindset in our regional office that we were going to do that. So much so that we created a math lead team, which Ronnie led, which was fantastic. And it was primarily teachers who were in the classroom. And they engaged in some research-based learning, some shared learning around what are best practices for our students. And so they were also able to take that learning back to their school sites. And so with that, what happened is that we started to understand the shift that was required to create a TK-12 system, which is what we have. Because our secondary had gone through some shifts in their math curriculum, we were trying to align to what Ronnie explained, which was more of a student-centered curriculum. And so some of the things that happened before that, some of the ways that we had built that, is that our organization is really dedicated to its equity commitments for our students. And so folks had been to Standards Institute in previous years. There's a lot of folks who have read things like The Opportunity Myth. And so that was not difficult because there were some things that were in place before this curriculum adoption started. The other thing, which Ronnie explained, is that we surveyed teachers even before we started the math adoption process to understand what were their needs with curriculum and instructional materials.
That's wonderful. And it sounds like a lot of this opportunity was something that you could build off of some of the pre-existing groundwork and professional development that Aspire is already invested in. I'd love to hear from you, Karen, about mindset and consensus building over at Capistrano.
Thank you. Yeah, so we started off by creating our vision. What was our mission? What was our vision? Before we ever started thinking about any curriculum, coming together and making those decisions together as a team. And so we had a tiered approach in creating this mindset. It definitely started with a steering committee of teachers, and they dug deep into the data. And from that data, we came out with very specific needs and also with teacher input. From that, it went into an adoption committee, which the steering committee was part of. And that adoption committee then started to look at materials through the lens of what our vision said, that we believed that all students are capable of learning math. An advantage we had is 7 years ago, we did district-wide trainings in cognitively guided instruction. And so even though we had materials that didn't align with that pedagogy, we knew that student-centered sense-making in math and teacher-facilitated instruction using the effective teaching practices from NCTM were critical. And so how could we supplement our materials in ways or use our materials in ways that would support students and leverage students' agency so that they felt that every student could learn math. And so through that PD over the last 7 years, it wasn't hard to come up with that vision. I think if we hadn't had a lot of book studies with intentional talk and orchestrating productive mathematical, the 5 practices for orchestrating productive mathematical discussions and math learning walks. And so it's like all of that pre-work grounded us for what we felt we needed. And the time was right. Teachers were ready. Our students deserved us to give them material. And so the need to wait waiting did not outweigh for new materials to come out in 2 years. I mean, we needed to get students and teachers and materials sooner than later because our students deserved it.
Yeah, that what really resonates with me in both of your answers is really how you embarked on this journey. First, starting with what a really coherent vision of what you want math instruction to look like in your schools, and one that it's shared and it's really thoroughly developed before you even touched a set of curriculum to see if it would even be a good fit. And so often it feels like we're trying to shape mindsets around a curriculum or a set of instructional practices instead of ensuring that the materials we're looking at are reflective of the unique needs of our schools and our students in this moment in time, right? And we all know that we don't do this work alone, but rather with a variety of partners across our schools and our communities. And can you share more about what engagement looked like with your variety of educational partners, whether it's students, families, teachers, or other important groups? And what did that look like during your adoption process? Karen, can you start?
Sure, thanks, Kara. Starting with the vision of a student, what did we want our students to feel that they had a part to play in the mathematics? And so ensuring that our educational partners, first and foremost, were our students and their families. And so one of the non-negotiables that we came up with our teachers was that families would be given materials, and both of our publishers offered materials for families, so that families felt included in the mathematical journey that their child or student was on. And so engaging with families and students was critical. We surveyed our families at the end of each pilot. So one pilot hasn't been surveyed yet because we're still in the middle of it, and asked them questions about, did they feel empowered to support their child or student at home? We asked students, did you feel that your math thinking was amplified in the class? Now, of course, some of the language I'm using with us here today, we put it in more student-friendly terms, but we really wanted to see how the students felt positioned in the classroom to make sense of the math, to be able to communicate their reasoning, and what was their takeaway from, right now having curriculum that was more in alignment with those effective teaching practices and the mathematical practices. And so the other part of it was engaging with administration. So we did math learning walks. We went into classrooms where teachers were piloting. We weren't necessarily watching teachers. We were really looking at what students were doing and how they were thinking and processing. And if they were motivated, were they engaged? Were they feeling a sense of belonging in that math community? Those are huge things that sometimes you can't tell from the paper and the lesson plan, but you can feel it when you walk in a room. We also partnered with our Office of Language Acquisition here at the district level and brought them in to provide our teachers with information around what does strong instruction look like for our multilanguage learners? How are we teaching content and language simultaneously? It shouldn't be separate. How can we get past just a sentence starter or a sentence stem? Where's the place for that in the curriculum? And how can we make sure that we're giving teachers ways to scaffold language instruction within the math content? So those are some of the ways that we engage with our educational partners.
I love that. And one thing that I really resonated with me was how you were sharing. There's some real transparency in the process about how you are engaging educational partners, other educational partners with others. So for example, letting teachers know that we're going to be sharing these materials and engaging students and families in this way, in a in a way that is unique to them and their perspective, so that it doesn't feel like there's a lot of questions in the air, and it doesn't feel like, oh, I'm just engaging in this solely as my like one opportunity as a teacher. But rather there's also like the student perspective and also the the family and parent perspective, which is going to be included and thought about as well. Leilani and Ronnie, can you share about how you included educational partners in Aspire's adoption process?
Similar to what Karen lifted up, early on in the process, we decided it was critical that all of our educational partners were engaged and had significant voice throughout the process. I'll start us with our primary users, our students, and then move on from there. So with our students, during the pilot, all participating students were given a survey in order to provide input after each curricular pilot. And then some students were also engaged in empathy interviews, which really gave us just deeper insight into their experience with each of the curriculum. In terms of family, during the pilot, we hosted a webinar and we had the two publishers come out and present. Families were able to ask questions, get answers to really understand the pros and cons of each of the curriculum through their perspective. At the end of that webinar, they completed a survey, and based on that survey, we revised our final rubric, which was used during the vetting process. In terms of our educators, we wanted to go big. We wanted to make sure that all educators had a voice or had the option to opt in throughout the process. So similar to families, all educators were invited to a separate webinar for them. We had the publishers present, and also they completed a survey in order to help us revise and enhance our rubric during that final vetting process. Early on in the process, during our winnowing curriculum days, so we had 6 publishers come out, they presented, and from there we narrowed it down to 2 that would be moving on to the pilot phase. We opened that up to all educators to attend those sessions. As Leilani mentioned earlier, I think that the highlighter, or what I'm most proud of, is our math lead team. So we created our math lead team early in the adoption process. It's comprised of about 8 to 10 teachers and ed specialists. And this team was tasked with enhancing the adoption process, to engaging in the pilot, to revising the rubrics, to every step along the way. And this is actually the group that made the final recommendation for approval on which curriculum we were adopting. So it was teachers in our CMO that said, this is the curriculum that works best for students, and we are behind it 100%. In terms of admin district leaders, again, similar to what Karen shared, we did walkthroughs and observations during the pilot process. They gave input on the strategic plan and also the curriculum adoption process. And I think what was key as well is we had frequent communication going out to all of our leaders and educators. So throughout the entire process, we were really transparent with data sharing. We shared rubric scores, different data charts, interview summaries. So everyone along the way knew exactly where we were headed and the why behind it as well.
Wow, that's really impressive. And something that is just dawning on me as we talk about this is that, this is a really important, thorough, comprehensive process. And sometimes it feels like, we have to build a plane from scratch, but we know that there are resources out there and we're not alone. And hopefully there's obviously part of the webinar series and why we're choosing to host this and participate is because there's real utility in sharing our stories and our experiences, and then also other resources that are available. And we know that there's pre-existing resources and tools out there. So what specific tools, resources, or partnerships did you lean on most and you found most helpful during your adoption process? And could you share what made them particularly useful? Karen, let's start with you.
Sure, thank you. Well, Cal curriculum, definitely. The tools and resources that I received at a 2-day professional development training a year ago really were critical in understanding the data-driven process and the shared decision-making. And then it needed to be a guiding coalition movement that included all of those educational partners, and that creating that vision was essential at the beginning. making sure that you collected data frequently and that you calibrated questions that you were going to ask teachers to use to evaluate curriculum. So the professional development and resources from Cal Curriculum were pivotal. As a former Ed Reports reviewer, I reviewed some pilot material or some material back in 2015. I knew the value of those reports, being part of that process for 6 months and understanding the amount of level of calibration and rigor that goes into evaluating and writing those reports. So of course we looked at Ed Reports to guide our process, but really making sure that any tool you use comes from the will and the calibration and the design of the group. So it's really it's a shortcut, but don't take it in taking someone else's evaluation tool, like what the questions they ask. The questions need to be generated, right? Learning by doing. Whoever's doing the talking and the learning is doing the thinking. And so if we were going to use any kind of tools to evaluate curriculum, they really needed to be generated from our own data and our own needs and our own vision. But of course, we went and looked at the IMET, the Instructional Materials Evaluation Toolkit. They gave us some good starting points. We looked at the rough draft of the framework. So even though it wasn't adopted until this summer, chapter 13 of the framework tells us what instructional materials should look like to support equitable and engaging learning. And so looking at the things that were in that rough draft, it didn't change much when the framework was adopted in July, but definitely looking at multiple points of different resources and partnerships with different Cal Curriculum and reports, those type of tools and resources.
Yeah, that is really insightful. And again, these processes are not there, they can't be duplicative of each other, right? But more so, these are tools and resources that serve as sources of inspiration and a basis for this work. Leilani and Ronnie, can you share what tools or resources you utilized in Aspire's adoption process?
I will also echo Cal Curriculum as one of the primary resources. I had the opportunity to attend a Cal Curriculum PD back in, I think it was 2022 during the pandemic, and had a lot of takeaways from it. So when the opportunity came up in January of 2023 for the 2-day PD, I took our math lead team to the Cal Curriculum PD in I think it was Anaheim. And during that process, the math lead team was able to revise, enhance, and provide really key feedback on input on the curriculum adoption process. So Cal Curriculum, a lot of the guidance and resources really set the foundation for our curriculum adoption plan. In terms of the more granular level, I really leaned on Instruction Partners' curriculum support guides. So there's a ton of just rich tools that you can pull from. Too many to look at probably, but a ton of tools there. We were committed to only bringing in high quality instructional materials into our classrooms. So we leaned on Ed Reports, Louisiana Believes, Massachusetts Department of Ed, and Oregon Department of Ed to see what they rated as high quality. And then I'll just live up in terms of collaboration. I frequently checked in with Leilani here to make sure like whose voices are being left out, who else do we need to bring into this work to really make sure to take a step back, because when you're in the weeds, sometimes it's hard to lose sight of the vision. So frequent collaboration, communication there as well.
And so I'm so happy to hear that there is a wealth of resources out there, and that this work will continue to evolve, and the conversations that we're having today and as a part of this webinar series will also serve as inspiration and resources for many future districts who are probably either considering adoption or in the process of implementation as we look forward to the now with a newly adopted framework. And, as we might have some folks who are with us now that are considering adoption or they're in the adoption process. What's one piece of advice that you'd want to share with other districts or CMOs that are considering adopting, or they're currently in the adoption process. What would you share with them, Leilani?
Yeah, I probably have more than one, but I'll give my quick communication and transparency in the process, which I think both Karen and Ronnie mentioned, is important. I think there are teachers out there that maybe can't pilot for whatever reason, but they still deserve to know what's happening. And putting one of the wonderful things that Ronnie did was she put the research out there available for anybody who wanted to see, even though maybe they weren't directly piloting. So I think that most of our region really knew what was going on, even though they weren't maybe on the math lead team or maybe they weren't pilot teachers. And so when adoption is one thing, and we are deep into the implementation year, and so that is quite another thing. But it made it easier that our adoption year was so transparent and so clear that people were really ready by the next year to start to do the work. And the other thing that is helpful, we have a really helpful executive director, and he is supported us in coming up with a catchy logo. It is the year of math. And so what that means is that we are aligning priorities. And so in an implementation year, we're not having a bunch of other things taking center stage. It was very much our adoption, and then we knew it was going to be an implementation year. And so we are aligning our initiatives as a regional office in order to support math this year. And that feels really nice and feels really clear.
That resonates with me. Not only the communication and transparency, I think it helps lay the foundation for the breadth and the depth of the effort. Karen, what is your one piece of advice? We don't need to limit it to one. We can do one or two for other districts who are either considering adopting or are in the adoption process.
I'm glad that you said I don't have to narrow it to one, because I was trying to figure out which one I was going to pick. I would say that there's high quality instructional materials out there now, and the need to wait doesn't justify letting our students and our teachers wait. And so both when we went into the pilot process, some of our critical questions to our publishers were, when materials are updated in alignment, and more of an alignment, because I would say they are aligned, and more of an alignment to some of the ideas in the framework, will your materials adapt to that? And the publishers, of course, said yes, and we asked for evidence as to how they might do it, even though they didn't have concrete, but they came up with some ideas. So I feel like when we do adopt, when those materials adapt to some of the big ideas in the framework, one of them being centered around big ideas and more students learning through project-based or real-world applications, that both materials will align to that. Make sure that ensure you have a balance of teachers in your pilot that represent the demographics and diversity of your students. And that's critical, because we all come with different lenses depending on the students we serve. And as Leilani, I'll echo what she said, implementation. It's critical that whatever material you pick has this, that's just the starting point. So they're in that year one, so they could give more advice to the implementation part, but the adoption and the piloting process is just the first step. And the implementation and how you'll roll out the implementation to ensure that teachers have the support and guidance to internalize the design of the curriculum is critical.
Those are all very, very salient pieces of advice. So I'm glad I did not limit you to just one or two. And in terms of well, we did ask some of our registrants beforehand if they had any questions. And one of the questions that we had submitted was, what was your biggest aha moment during the adoption process? Karen, I'm sorry. Leilani answered for us last time. So Karen, will you go ahead and answer what your biggest aha moment was?
Yeah, so the need to accelerate learning. And so that word accelerate can have a lot of negative connotations in in the world, because we want to, in the math world, we don't want to think that students just go farther and not deeper. But how do we ensure that we have materials that help our teachers scaffold that just in time prerequisite skill that students might need? Because we can't go back years of instruction to make up time for gaps in understanding. So how can we make sure that we have materials that scaffold those prerequisite skills, that those just-in-time supports? And so that came out as a critical lens with teachers using the materials, that was very, very important.
Mm-hmm. And Leilani and Ronnie, what was an aha moment for Aspire? It might be individual, it might be a shared collective moment.
I think one of the ahas for me, which is probably a different aha for Ronnie, but I think it was about the system level. And so how do we use all of the things that we already have in place to communicate the shifts? Because it was a huge shift. And so for me, it was, oh, like all of these pieces, all of these systems, we have to communicate with principals, all the way we communicate with admin, the way we communicate with teachers. We need to utilize those in order to help the whole region go through this shift. And it was a shift. And so we didn't even have curriculum yet, but Ronnie and I were thinking about like, okay, well, what does May look like? What does June look like? What does summer PD look like? What does the next year look like? And we were trying to calendar. And then once again, that was a big aha that I was like, ooh, we need to involve this person and this person. And it's not just me doing this work. And so it really took a lot of moving pieces in order and getting those together in order to make what I think is so far a pretty successful implementation year. But that was a big aha. Like adopting is one thing, I think, as Karen said, is that we keep saying, and then the next few years are going to be quite another. And that is testing our systems. And so that was a big aha for me.
Ronnie, do you have an aha that you'd like to share?
The only thing coming up was we were really mindful about bringing in educator voice throughout the adoption process. And so we took that idea and we took that approach with designing our implementation plan for this year. So we asked teachers, what do you want and what do you need, as well as administrators? And based on that, that's how we designed the supports that they're receiving this next year. So voice throughout the entire process is key.
Yeah, and that's been very evident in the steps that you took to ensure that a multitude of voices and from our educational partners were said. And I'd like to know how you balanced your resources as you engaged in this process. Whether, when we're thinking about budget, time, people's capacity, how did you think about making those decisions in terms of your resources as you engaged in this year-long plus effort? Leilani or Ronnie, do you want to share about Aspire's efforts?
Yeah, budget was a big one. I think in CMOs, potentially the process is a little different than the way it goes in districts, where each principal really owns their school site budget. And so we had to work with our finance team and our executive directors to actually figure out what this was going to look like. And so once again, that was combining resources and combining efforts from different folks in different regional offices. So I think that it was always in our minds, like, how much is this going to cost? What do we do? And so, that wasn't like the main thing, but it is something that you really do have to think about. And poor Ronnie, right? She had to like ask and just how much and how do we go about doing this? And I think the answer really at the end of the day was, does this fit? Well, the thing that we chose, does it fit within within our budgets? And then how do we communicate that to principals so that they can start to budget with those priorities in mind? And then what does it look like 3 years from now? What does it look like 5 years from now? And so that's some of the strategic thinking that was needed by our finance team and executive directors to make those decisions.
Yes, budget is a very real reality that we have to work with as we engage in this process. Karen, how did Capistrano balance resources in the adoption process, whether it's budget, time, folks' capacity?
Yeah, that's a big question. Budget wasn't something we had to lead with or look at initially. It is something that we have met with both publishers we are piloting right now to find out about what does it look like for implementation, what types of supports are offered from the publisher, what types of supports are expected within the district to support the implementation, and start planning forward for that. Because like I said, just adopting the materials is just the very tip of the iceberg. And so thinking about those resources have become budget decisions, and not decisions about which material we'll get, but just planning forward for the implementation phase for years to come. Time, really sitting down and having a team of administrators and that steering committee and thinking about planning forward, like how are we going to collect data frequently? And how are we going to analyze that data when we come to consensus? And really making sure that that's a shared decision-making process, that it's, those of us at the district level as administrators, our voices are not included in that consensus process. The consensus comes from the data. And so making sure that you plan out that timeline of how you'll collect data from stakeholders or engage educational partners, how you will ensure that you have that information, and how will you analyze that information. Because it doesn't come down to the will of what a group wants, but what is the big picture of the will of the group that meets the needs of our students and families.
All right, and I do see that we have a question in our Q&A from our audience, our attendees, and we'd like to know, how did you go about selecting educators to pilot? I know that Karen, you mentioned ensuring that there's a diversity in the educators that you selected to pilot. I'd like to know more about what that looked like. And perhaps Aspire, you can start how you thought about that when you thought about your math team leads. Ronnie or Leilani?
Yeah, so I'll start by discussing our math lead team. So our math lead team, part of their role was to engage in the pilot process. So we're really thoughtful when we were selecting those members to have a range of grade levels. So from TK all the way through 8th grade, because it was a TK adoption, as well as roles. So we had gen ed teachers as well as ed specialists participating. So we make sure we had the range of people participating in the pilot. We wanted to make sure though during the pilot that we had voices from all of our schools. So we met with our site leaders, our administrators, and asked that each site send 2 to 3 teachers to participate in the pilot as well. And so we left that open for principals to decide who to attend, as framing it as a leadership opportunity for teachers. Like, you're going to be developing these curriculum, and you're going to also be able to provide voice. And so there was a lot more flexibility on who administrators selected, knowing that we had the math lead team already participating.
Yeah, that the vertical articulation in terms of just, for obvious like content and subject matter expertise it seems important, but I also really appreciate the school diversity. Ensuring that there's a representative from each school is really helpful, because I'm sure, as you know, in my experience, schools too have their own individual unique personalities and perspectives and cultures that they bring to conversations, and that's particularly important when we're engaging in a universal shared comprehensive adoption process. Karen, did you experience that as well when Capistrano went about selecting folks to engage in the pilot?
Yeah, it was interesting, because when I put out the survey to teachers, we have close to 800 elementary teachers, and I put out the survey on the pilot process and if they would like to apply to be part of it. and just to make sure and ensure that I had a balance of teachers that came from two-way language immersion sites where, instruction is in Spanish for, part of the day. And in math, K3, it's Spanish, instruction is in Spanish, and making sure that we have special ed teachers as part of the process. So I say it was interesting because I had close to 10% of our teachers want to be part of the process, which I thought was like, wow, and exciting. And so part of that group, then we were able to accommodate all of them to pilot, which is a daunting task, a daunting feat. So I had the opposite problem of trying to, some districts, they don't, well, I'm having an issue with getting pilot teachers. I'm in a middle school pilot we're launching here next month, and it was a little harder to get teachers. And so that process was a little different in ensuring that teachers knew that the process would be driven by data, and the decision making would be driven by the data. And so once they started to see that, I had more teachers come into it. But the goal will be to ensure that you do have representation across the diversity and demographics of your district, and ensure that teachers, if they're not willing to pilot and they're made to pilot, that creates a different set of circumstances. You definitely want the voices at the table that are ready to do the heavy lifting, because it is a heavy lift to pilot.
Yeah, and hearing that, and also balancing the opportunity that Leilani mentioned earlier, that while not all teachers are going to be selected to pilot, they still all deserve to know about the process and where the different levels, different opportunities to engage are. So that seems to be really resonating with me in this moment too. And you've all three of you have mentioned that adoption is just step one. Implementation is the next part that's on the horizon. How are you both thinking about implementation? So what does professional learning look like? And have you thought about what steps you're going to take to ensure that is a success given your adoption process? Aspire, would you like to start?
We are in the middle of year one implementation now. So I'll start with teacher lens first and then move into the admin lens. For our teachers, we have mapped out a 6-series PD scope and sequence, which is led by the publishers. And so with that, they're learning how to implement the curriculum with integrity. Internal PD is also provided for all of our teachers. The math academic program manager team, we are leading unit planning days for every single grade level for every single unit to make sure that we're starting with the standards, right? We are teaching standards, curriculum's a tool. And so we're creating these learning spaces where our sites can collaborate and really dig into the standards as well as the curriculum. In terms of our administrators, we have one-on-one walkthroughs with every admin, bi-weekly to monthly, depending on the school. We also have publisher-led PD 3 times a year for administrators, as well as district-led PD. In terms of shared learning experiences for administrators, we're engaging in instructional rounds. So we're doing rounds once at each site where we go through, we observe based on a problem of practice, and then the administrator can reflect and think through next steps. And I think the final thing for administrators is after each diagnostic, beginning, middle, and end of year, we're holding data step backs where we act as thought partners with administrators to think through what is the data telling us and what do we need to do differently to better support our students. I don't know, Leilani, did I miss anything?
No, you didn't miss anything, but I'll just add that's what it meant for us to really create this as a priority. Like if we would have been doing 5 other things like that, all of that work wouldn't have happened. And the other thing, to go back to priority. So Ronnie was a person of one, a team of one last year. And so now we've tripled the team. Now there's 3 people actually helping with math. So that's also a way that we budget for priorities and actually like staff our regional office, because Ronnie, although she's amazing, could not have done that all by herself in this implementation year. So that was also part of our restructuring a little bit with that.
That's really helpful. Karen, how are you thinking about implementation and the implementation process in the future looking like as Capistrano moves forward in the process?
It'll look very different than it has in the past. In the past, it was, all right, here are your new materials. Here's where you find this on page this, and this is this resource. And while we will still facilitate those days for teachers, that's not where we stop. So we're looking at a day of, like I just described, and then frequent touch points with the teachers throughout the first, for sure the first year, but probably through the first 3 years. But those touch points would be, okay, you've used the curriculum, now let's dig a little bit deeper into the why, into really looking at data and how we're shifting our instructional practices and how we're positioning those students as sense makers, and that role of the teacher, in highlighting the effective teaching practices from NCTM, and how are we rolling that out. So it's a slow roll over time. That initial shock will be, okay, here are the curriculum and these are all the parts, and but there has to be support along the way. Potentially that could lead into doing lesson studies and being able to have teachers come together and observe a lesson and debrief about it and go in and try it again in a different classroom. And so there's just different things, different models we're looking at. But again, we have a little bit of time. We've met with both publishers to talk through some of our requests and to see how they could support our vision.
That's wonderful. And, hearing both your responses, I'm realizing that a lot of the opportunities for implementation, while new, are going to be embedded and interwoven within already existing systems and structures of support. We do have a question from our attendees, and they'd love to know how you utilize coaching and PLCs in the implementation process. Aspire, do you utilize coaching or PLCs as part of the implementation process? Leilani or Ron?
Go ahead, Ronnie.
Yeah, so we're focusing this year on really developing our administrators to be instructional leaders and curriculum experts at their site. So the work that we're doing at the regional level is we meet with our administrators bi-weekly, monthly. We do walkthroughs and act as a thought partner. Like, what does coaching look like, or what does this teacher need in order to continue to experience success with the curriculum? And so at the site level, we have our principals, APs, deans, who are really tasked with engaging in coaching, observation, and feedback cycles with our teachers.
That's helpful. And Karen, how do you intend to utilize coaching or PLCs in the implementation process that you're planning?
Yeah, so in our professional learning communities, our teachers have been focused on the 4 critical questions of a PLC, mostly with the guiding questions of what will we do when students don't respond, and what will we do when students have already mastered the content. And so as part of that process, teachers have they prioritize standards, first of all, and have unwrapped standards. So they're thinking about those prerequisite skills and those building blocks that build learning targets within that standard. And so in our work of our PLC, I talked about it before, about that accelerating student learning by really understanding how to meet the needs of students that aren't showing progress towards mastering those prioritized standards. And so that was important for us in curriculum, that we had support in the materials to support that type of tiered instruction. As far as coaching goes, every one of our elementary school sites has a MTSS coach. They've been primarily focused on English language arts for the last 2 years, but are bringing on some of the math coaching starting this year a little bit. Just depends on the site and the site needs. We also have not very many, but district coaches that support our Title I schools, and they're taking on more of a math focus this year. So we're kind of all anticipating what's coming, and definitely see them as a critical part of the process, as well as our getting our administrators support to know what to look for in classrooms and how to support teachers in making those shifts So we've been doing math learning walks for the last year and a half, and we'll continue through this year and on to next year.
That's wonderful. And I have to close out our panel now because we're at our time and hand it back to my colleague, Alan. But I just wanted to thank all the three of you for joining me. And also it's really clear that there's a real level of intentionality and thoughtfulness and coherence and collaboration in the process that you've developed and are developing and are continuing to engage in, because we know it doesn't just stop at adoption. Implementation is really an inherent necessary next step for this process for high quality instructional materials. And it was really evident in the processes that you shared with us today. So thank you so much. And it was my pleasure to engage and learn more about your processes. And I know that others will find them just as useful as well. Alan.
Thanks, Kara. Yeah, once again, thank you, Ronnie, Leilani, and Karen for sharing so much of your knowledge and experience with us. And thank you, Kara, for your excellent facilitation. Last but not least, thank you all for joining us. Please take a few seconds now to complete our poll. This really gives us helpful information about your thoughts on the session. And we use your thoughts to inform the next webinar session, which, speaking of, you can register for that at the link that has been dropped in the chat. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you next time, and we hope you have a great rest of your evening.